Enclosure is a street that turned Nutley from being a factory town into a prosperous community filled with creativity and progress. Enclosure had the perfect lighting and environment to inhabit over a dozen artists throughout Nutley's history. But whether it was by coincidence or something else, there is one house on Enclosure that has housed 5 artists alone. This is the story of 16 Enclosure, a house that has created works of art for over 100 years.
The Enclosure attracted a lot of artists for 2 principal reasons. One was its proximity to New York. People could come and go on the train, and most of the artists who arrived on the Enclosure had previously been working in painting in New York. The second reason is the topography of the area. If you look at old pictures of the Enclosure, you'll see there's a big valley that runs down to where the mud hole is. So if you stand on the Enclosure and face north, which is where all artist studios have skylights facing north, you will see that there was a lot of beautiful natural light coming in.
It was an undeveloped area in Nutley for the longest time. It took an individual who was a lawyer and a real estate developer on both sides of the Hudson, New York and New Jersey, James Hay, to purchase the property and develop it into an area where businessmen from New York could come and live. And he befriended some of these artists. So I think Nutley in general was a very desirable place to live at that point. I think Enclosure in particular, overlooking the mud hole, which was never going to be developed, it was always going to be park-like, it was a place for these artists to come and sort of relax and concentrate on their art. So the number of artists that lived over the creative period, let's say, on Enclosure, was anywhere from a dozen or so to about 20. Not all of them were famous, not all of them are in the record books, some you just sort of have to piece together. We talk about 5 artists living at 16 Enclosure.
The house was existent as probably about 1855 on. The first artist who moved there was a painter named Frank Fowler. Frank Fowler was born in Brooklyn in 1852. He went and studied in Paris. One of his most famous projects there were murals that are in the Medici Palace in the Luxembourg Gardens. So he came back to America when he was about 25 years old, had a studio in New York, moved to 16 Enclosure Nutley, built the studio on the back of the house. I grew up in that house, and you can see the outline of a window that was closed in on the back of the house at the time they built the studio. His probably most ambitious project was to paint murals in the dining area of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, in this something called the Maritime Dining Room.
In terms of panel painting, Frank Fowler does a lot of portraits of people, oil portraits. He's a very good draftsman, paints really well. The Nutley Museum has got a beautiful portrait of his done of an old woman dating to the late 1880s. The rest of his paintings are really just scattered in private museums.
So he lived there until mid-1890s, at which point he sold the house to another American painter named Frederick Dana Marsh. Frederick Dana Marsh he's often called an illustrator in books of American art history, which is a little bit dismissive of his talents. He was really quite a wonderful painter. He did a lot of posters for World War I for raising money for the armed forces.
His most famous maybe work in New York City, which you can still see bits and pieces of, is a set of murals that he did for the McAlpin Hotel, which was in Herald Square. They were saved and now they're on display in the Fulton Street subway station on Broadway in Manhattan.
So Frederick Dana Marsh was the father of Reginald Marsh, who became one of the most important and famous artists ever to come from Nutley.
He goes on to form a school of painting that's more about social realism. So he's not painting beautiful, high-class people in party or cafe settings. He's out in the streets of New York painting burlesque, painting the workers on the subways, really getting down and dirty with what the new urban experience is, and he becomes famous for that kind of work. His best work, you can see it today, what is the Custom House at the foot of Broadway in New York City. The building is now part of the Smithsonian Museum. Reginald Marsh paints these incredible murals, again, about New York shipping history, ships coming into the harbor, unloading their goods. Customs were very important when this was built. New York had the biggest docks in the country. They took in the most goods.
The next artist who lived at 16 Enclosure was a man named Guy Pen Dubois, who rented the house from the Marsh family for only a couple of years, like 1917, 1918. He didn't really like Nutley very much. He actually wrote some very dismissive things about the talents of the other artists who lived on the Enclosure. He said they were untalented and only pretending to be artists, so he hightailed it and went back to New York City.
In fact, his family, who's from the Bronx, is heavily French, and they live as much in France as they do in the Bronx. So he goes back and forth between both worlds. He is trained as a painter in France, and he winds up painting sort of high society. He paints people in cafes and at theaters. He's also an illustrator, and he's an art critic for magazines.
There was no artist in the house until 1941, at which point my father purchased it from the Marsh family, and the house remained in our family for 50 years or so. My father was born in Russia in 1903. His family came to New York, emigrated in 1911, grew up on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, went to high school with Lou Gehrig, the famous baseball player. My father always had a love of art and always wanted to be a painter. So he worked in magazines. He used to say airbrushing shoes and direct mail catalogs. 1928, when he was 25, he won a $3,000 Challenger Foundation grant and went off to Paris and London to study painting for 4 years. 1932, he came back, had some very successful exhibitions in New York, but as you know, in the 1930s, it was time for the Great Depression. So he wasn't making any money. He was having a very hard time keeping himself fed. So my father was very resourceful. He came over to Newark, New Jersey, and went to WPA headquarters on Halsey Street and got accepted on the projects. Over the next 5 or 6 years, he painted murals around the state of New Jersey. He painted murals at Weequahic High School in Newark. He painted the history of Newark murals that are in Newark City Hall. He also painted a mining mural that's in the post office of Mount Hope, West Virginia. My father was called, in Who's Who in American Art, was called New Jersey's most important muralist because he had done all this mural work. And he continued to paint until he died in 1971.
Before the artists came to Nutley, Nutley was never a place where artists would think of living. We were a mill town. Our trains brought coal here. They didn't bring lawyers and doctors. Then all of a sudden, the coal mines shut down. Nutley was probably at a pivot point as to what the town was going to become without that. Luckily, we had the railroad, and luckily we had a couple of these prescient real estate developers who saw what could happen. Someone like James Hay, who developed Enclosure, and they remade our town. They remade our town into something where doctors and lawyers were now, and business people were now getting on those same trains and going into Jersey City to go in and out of Manhattan to their places of business.
At the time my mother passed away and I sold the house at 16 Enclosure, my dearest wish was that another artist would come in and work in the studio and use the studio. But I was unable to find an artist to come in, so I sold it, and as I locked it up and left for the last time, I thought, My father was the last artist who will ever live and paint on the Enclosure, but I was very wrong. Because about 10 years ago, a very important American artist named Gary Irby bought a house all the way down the end of the Enclosure and has been living and painting here for these many years. I like to think that there's something in the air or the water around the Enclosure which continues to attract painters to come and work there.
So to me, the biggest thing is that towns and cultures change, and there's always a way to reinvent yourself sort of to the positive. These guys did it in a beautiful way, and I think that can always continue to happen.
Although Enclosure is no longer an artist haven like it used to be, Nutley wouldn't be the town that it is today without it. The artists that live there now only live in Nutley's history archives, but perhaps the aura that attracted so many artists is still there, like a hidden treasure within Nutley.